Hello everybody, this is ManuS and welcome to another Eternal set review for the Fall of Argenport, today with the Justice cards. So let's dive right in. Okay, so first we have Crownwatch Standard. This is one of the more decent standards. Basically we get a 2-cost Finest Hour with Crownwatch tactic that gives lifesteal. The lifesteal is probably worth more than some people might realize, simply because it can heavily swing a race in your favor or make sure you don't lose a close game against pressure from an aggro deck, for example. So the card, while seemingly a worse effect to cost ratio than Finest Hour, similar to the time standard with the teleport comparison, this is definitely a much better tactic in my book than the time one, simply because the lifesteal can do a whole lot for a deck that cares about combat tricks like this and make it pretty swingy. This is probably most fitting in these aggressive, justice-based mid-range decks, since most aggro decks usually don't want any depleted power sources at all, so they can't really fit this, and they also don't care that much about the lifesteal. The decks that really care about the lifesteal are basically the racing, slower, aggressive mid-range decks that either play defense against more aggressive decks or try to raise other mid-range decks, for example. And in Limited, this is a pretty great trick/power source, so feel free to pick it up. Next we have Harmless Question, 0 cost on an enemy unit. This is basically not playable and constructed outside of very fringe corner cases. If you have a deck that cares about cheap spells and is also hyper aggressive, this might be okay, but even then this is pretty situational and low impact, so I don't see this being played anytime soon. But it could go in one of these justice-based spells matters decks theoretically, but I don't think they will be aggressive enough and in demand, need that many spells that they will have to resort to stuff like this. And in Limited, this is probably even worse, unless you have like a super hyper-aggressive deck, which happens once in a blue moon in draft, basically. And basically never in sealed. Next we have Iron Fist Faithful. This is unfortunately also a bit too weak in a evasive aggro deck like the Combray Flyers deck that I built a couple of months ago. This might be a nice alternative to the 1/1 Nightfall Wisp that I was playing, also because it has Valkyrie synergies to potentially run the 4-drop Valkyrie that becomes a 6/6. But yeah, other than that, this will just be too low impact, because on turn 1 on curve where you want your 1-drop, it's a 1/1 flying, and later you get the bonus of tribute potentially, but then you don't have a 1-drop, so it's a bit awkward. And in Limited, it's in a similar spot. Next we have Lingering Influence. This is sort of an additional depleted justice power source that scouts, so kind of like a crest in mono justice. It has the upside of, for example, on turn 2, if you don't have a turn 2 play, you can play a depleted power and use the other power to play this, while if it was an actual depleted power, you could only play one of your 2 depleted powers. So mixing depleted power and seek Lingering Influence, like 1-cost virtual depleted power sources, is nice because it diminishes the drawback of both, so to speak, and is a bit better than exclusively actual depleted power sources that are not spells with a cost instead. So yeah, there might be some decks that can afford some of these because they don't need the fixing of Seek power, and this is much better than the Justice favor, so this is basically a new better favor for some Justice decks. So keep that in mind, but also don't go crazy over it. A Scout is not worth screwing up your curve and putting you behind on tempo in the end, so use it wisely. And in Limited, this is a pretty easy inclusion in basically any Limited deck. Then we have Peacekeepers Helm, the 1-cost +1/+2 weapon, clearly too bad for constructed. In Limited it's still not great, but if your deck has weapon synergies it is decent, because on 5 you also get to play a Rebuke, but even that is not worth a full card, so the card is still pretty underwhelming in Limited. But yeah, you might want some weapons in your deck, and then this could be okay as a filler. Next we have Sharpened Reflex. This is a pretty decent card actually. I think in these spells matter type decks, this could actually be playable since the +1/+1 is permanent. So it's a nice alternative to Finest Hour. So if +1/+1 is enough to win combat, this is much better than Finest Hour. Because first of all, the stat is permanent. Second of all, you get to scout, so this is really nice. But it is a bit fringe since it only lets you win close fights and can be a bit low impact if you're not using it to win a combat or counter a torch or relic weapon or something. But it's definitely an interesting card to keep in mind for the right kind of deck. This could be actually pretty sweet to great. And in limited, this is a pretty great inclusion for most Justice decks, I would say. Then we have Spire Spellsword. This is the first spells matter unit, the 1/1 for 1, and if you play a spell, it gets +1/+1 and lifesteal this turn, but that usually is just too weak since there's not that many good cheap spells that you proactively can use, so this actually pressures enough, and then on 2 you want to play your 2-drop, so you just attack for 1 and so on. Just a bit too weak and limited or constructed really, even in decks that are built around this kind of mechanic, which in Magic is called prowess. Here it's just, yeah, not keyworded yet, but it might become keyworded down the line, similar to Scout, which got keyworded late. Next we have Arcane Defense. This is basically another limited only card. Give 2 enemy units -1 attack this turn. This is a bit low impact, but in the right spots it can be very devastating in combat to your opponent if they set up 2 trades and then you just blow them out. But this is very likely just filler material at best still in limited, because it's a bit, yeah, the marginal effect and requires fairly specific scenarios to be useful enough to invest 2 power in a card. Next we have Bar the Gates. This is kind of an interesting card. It's sort of like Justice answer to slow. It costs twice as much, that definitely makes it a lot worse, but it, instead of making the card cost twice and potentially locking it out completely if it's expensive, or not doing anything really if it's cheap, this just guaranteed locks out the card of your choice and all copies of the card for 3 turns permanently. So, for example, if they have a torch that you don't want to see for the next 3 turns, you can even like use this on a torch, which you couldn't on with a slow. And it also affects extra copies they draw, which slow does not. So it basically just protects you from a card of your choice in the opponent's hand for 3 turns, which might be something that you are looking for sometimes. So this is potentially a decent sideboard card if you're playing in a format with sideboard, or could be an okay one-off market target for some decks. But other than that, the card is not really playable. It's not a main deckable card, and it's also not a limited card at all. Next we have Barricade. Not much to say here. Pretty unplayable and constructed, this type of card. Like defensive combat tricks, not a good card. In limited, this is a decent pseudo removal. Yeah, killing any, like almost any attacker in combat as long as you have a blocker for it. For 2 power is a decent trick. But make sure you don't put this in your aggro limited deck. Next we have Encouragement. 2 power spell, not a fast spell, that's important. It has warp and gives a unit +2/+2 and flying this turn. So basically if you don't warp this, the card is really bad, and even if you warp it, it is not great. I don't think this is playable at all in constructed really, even in these spells matter type decks, I think, because every time you're not warping it, you have a bad card in your deck and in your hand. And yeah, in limited, this could be like borderline playable in very aggressive decks, but I'm not excited about it in any format really. And last but not least, for the first part of the Justice review, we have Iron Fist Chancellor. So all in all, I think the card is really cool. It's a 2 power 2/2 with an activated ability that doesn't exhaust it and is not an ultimate, which basically gives you a 2/2 soldier, so a copy of the base body with a copy of each weapon that is attached to Iron Fist Chancellor, and you can use that as often as you can. You can use it twice in a turn if you have 10 power. You can use it every turn. There's no limitation to it, so this can really run rampant and take over the game. And with Tribute, you get to play a +2/+2 longsword on Iron Fist Chancellor. The problem here basically is that on turn 2, it's very, very hard to play this as anything but a 2/2, and a vanilla 2/2 on turn 2 is really bad and constructed. So you basically would have to play this in an aggro deck with enough 1-drops to preferably force the opponent to trade or block your 1-drop, so that you can play this on turn 2 as a 4/4. Then it's really powerful, especially because of the threat that it presents a couple turns down the line. And you would also have to play enough additional 2-drops to make sure that you always have a proper 2-drop in addition to Chancellor, because you can't count on Chancellor being a 4/4 on turn 2, and you really don't want to play it as a 2/2 on turn 2 usually. So it's basically a 2-cost unit, but not a 2-drop most of the time. But it can really take over a game, which not that many 2-drops can say about themselves, so that is really good. And also, if you play more weapons that you can put on this becomes even more of a threat. Like on 6 power you can keep copying it and pay the spellcraft of, say, your Copper Hull Bracers, for example, and that is really hard to beat for anyone if you get to that point, for example. So this is comparable to Chthon, except that unfortunately their base body is significantly worse than Chthon. Having endurance and 3 health makes Chthon a pretty good blocker early on, and also a decent attacker, while Iron Fist Chancellor is a terrible blocker and not a good attacker either. So that's a big problem. But yeah, keep this card in mind. I think it has its potential, and there might be the right deck that can properly utilize and support it, because the power is definitely there. It's just a bit awkwardly situational in some scenarios. And in Limited, this is a snap pick. It's the kind of card that just can win the game on its own in Limited later, and a 2/2 for 2 is nothing to cry about in Limited usually either, so it's much better early and also much more likely to take over the game later. So yeah, really good card. Okay, that's it for the first half of the Justice cards. We're gonna continue with the second part in a moment, so stay tuned.